Good afternoon. It's always nice to have a sold-out crowd. So welcome. I am Andy Schmidt-Andrus, and I'm the director here at Kaufman Museum. Our program this afternoon is part of a series. It's held all the programs are being held in conjunction with the current exhibition, Unlocking the Past, Immigrant Artifacts and the Stories They Tell. And just to let you know about a few more programs that we do have coming up in the future. Celebrate Kansas Day on the 25th of January from 12 to 4. You'll be able to see the Unlocking exhibit, and the theme does go with the exhibit. It's a At Home on the Range. So that is January 24. Following that, February 9 at 3 o'clock, Sunday afternoon at the museum. Free did not always mean equal, and that is with Carmeletta Williams from the Black Archives of Mid-America in Kansas City, and that will be held in conjunction or in collaboration with Humanities Kansas. Following that, on March 30, we have another Sunday afternoon at the museum program, and that one is titled The Impact of Immigration on Mennonite Churches Today, and that one will be by Michelle Armster from MCC and Heidi Regier-Kreider from Western District Conference. The ethnic groups that John Sharp will discuss this afternoon lived in harmony as they learned to share the same land. That has not always been the case in North America. To acknowledge the shift and the harm that took place in Kansas, I'd like to read a land acknowledgement before we begin. We recognize that Kaufman Museum stands on the prairie where many original peoples farmed and hunted before the arrival of European and North American settlers, particularly the Wichita, the Kaw, and the Osage. As you visit Kaufman Museum exhibitions today and participate in today's program, we ask that you honor the contributions Native Americans have made to our nation's heritage and commit to respecting their descendants and learning about their rich cultural traditions. For our program today, I'm pleased to introduce John Sharp. John is retired from teaching history and Bible at Hesston College. John now leads tours to Anabaptist sites in Europe, to Prague and to Poland, and to Central Asia, exploring the Great Trek Migration. When he isn't traveling, John writes, keeps the house, and cares for his North Newton grandchildren when needed. Today, he will tell the story of 900 Mennonites who made the journey to Central Asia between 1880 and 1882. Just 6 years after 18,000 Mennonites began immigrating to Central North America. While some went to Kyrgyzstan, about half settled near the Silk Road city of Khiva in Uzbekistan. In the village called Akhmechet in Uzbekistan, they lived and thrived for 51 years until they were deported under Stalin. The good story is how they lived in harmony with their Muslim neighbors. And I want to stop for just a moment and acknowledge that we have numerous audience members who are descendants of individuals who participated in the Great Trek. Specifically, I'd like to point out that Mark Esau, can you wave your hand? There he is. Mark Esau and family members are here from Oklahoma. Mark is the grandson of Gerhard Esau, and he donated the woodworking cabinet that is in the Unlocking exhibit. So be sure you take a look if you haven't gotten to look at that already, and we're grateful for your donation. And I'm curious if there are others in the audience who are related. John, go ahead and stand up so you can see them. Raise your hand high. Raise your hand high if you are related in some ways. More than half a dozen, going on a dozen. All right, great. Well, the Uzbeks' memories of the German-speaking, somberly dressed Mennonites is commemorated in a restored village that will be a tourist destination celebrating the cultural harmony, intercultural harmony. At the end of the presentation, John will show photos of the exhibits in the new Mennonite Museum in Khiva. Please help me welcome John Sharp.
What a delight to see you all. I am privileged to share this story. It's a story that has become very near and dear to me after 6 tours to Uzbekistan. And one of those tours we also did Turkistan. It wasn't wise, but we did it. The most outstanding memory of that is when we were in Turkistan, our bus broke down. So I have pictures of 50 people trying to push the bus ahead. Finally, taxis came along, picked us up, took us into town. All right, here we go. Many of you have history with this. Many of you know stories I don't know. And I'd be welcome, you'd be welcome to share those stories. And by the way, I will give you permission to interrupt if you have a question. I know that's dangerous, but if I've got to get to it, I'll tell you to hold it, and we'll get there eventually. But yeah, feel free to interrupt and ask questions if something is not clear. Are you raising your hand already? We'll get to it. You gotta watch some people. Okay, so to start from the beginning. 1880, 81.
Can you stay towards the microphone?
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't have one that follows me. Do I? Okay. So from 2 Russian provinces, from the Mennonite colony and from Antrakt in Samara, some 900. And the numbers keep adding up because new names are added. And so they decided, hey, we're going to travel. We're going to migrate. So 5 wagon trains set out. The biggest one was from Molochna. Thank you. The other 4 were from various places, but many of them from Samara. Some made a very long trip to get here. So, what would cause you to pack up your household goods, your kids, and perhaps a spouse who's not excited about this, to go on a trip to an unknown destination? Well, I guess Abraham and Sarah did it. So these Mennonites could do it too. And they did. All right, let's talk about numbers. Current count is 111 families, some 909 members, 246 wagons, and you see the miles. Others are similar. One is longer than all the others because of the northern route they took to get there. So, 15 weeks on the road, 18 weeks on the road, 4 months on the road. Will your family endure? Will they say, all right, enough, I'm going home? I wish we had more diaries of women who would tell us how they did not want to go. And especially after they buried children along the way. That had to be painful. It was painful. But they kept going. They believed God was leading them there. Now, to put it in context, here is Central Asia. And you see our context for the story. Well, somewhere there. But this is along the Great Silk Road. Silk roads plural, ran from Xi'an, China, to Europe. And there were various routes. And they did not know what they were getting into. They had this vision. They were driven by a sense of urgency. But why? Well, number one was to escape military conscription in the Russian Empire. A number of families had sons who would soon be 18 and would be drafted. And this is number one. Aside from any millennial stuff, this is why 18,000 of you migrated westward, in 1874 and following. Now, there was a meeting, a send-off of some of these 18,000 that were going west. Abram Peters, who was the leader of the trek that went to Turkistan, blessed them, prayed for them, and then reminded them they're going the wrong way. The Antichrist lives in North America.
Yeah.
And we believe he does. They also wanted, like everybody else, every other Mennonite migration, new economic opportunities, of course. Manage their own affairs, especially in the case of education, because the Empire of Russia was beginning to get down on Mennonites for using their own schools, their own language. He said, no, you've got to Russify. You've got to become like us. Well, knowing Mennonites as I do, they refused. Martin Clausen says, they wanted to live according to their faith. And of course, that has many ramifications. And, as I said, escape the great tribulation of the West and prepare for the imminent return and rule of Christ. They were quite sure that they were in the ballpark of when this was going to happen and where it was going to happen. And, it only made sense to keep going east. After all, from Holland to Prussia to Russia is more or less eastward, and Asia is a clear departure from there. It made sense to them. And there was, of course, this millennial vision. Typically, that's all we hear about. It was there, and everybody shared it, but it was not the main theme everywhere. This vision was already present in Prussia. It was nurtured in Utrecht and the Galatian colonies. And yes, Peters said, you're going the wrong way. And Jung Stilling was a scientist who wrote a novel. And in the novel, the main character has an Anabaptist wife. So this young couple is fleeing the Antichrist, and they go eastward, and it only made sense to go. And Mennonites saw themselves as the faithful remnant, the Church of Philadelphia. Of course, don't we always look for the best label for ourselves? One could have made other cases, but they called themselves the Church of Philadelphia, and they were going to find a refuge. So, motivation? I say fiction, scripture, history equal their destiny. How do you line up? How do you line up your values when you're making that choice? Yeah. Das Heimweh, Jung Stilling. At one point, somebody accosted him and said, what you wrote is not true. He said, of course it isn't. I wrote a novel. You weren't supposed to treat it as history or prophecy. So Franz March, one of the ministers on the trek, has this to say about prophetic writings. Is there anybody who is too far away to read this text? Yeah, okay. Prophetic writings which dealt with Christ's second coming came to dominate most of the preaching in the tract. In fact, So many sermons emphasized this teaching that it became very much part of the common spiritual heritage, says Franz Marsh. And this was not just a Mennonite thing. Many Christians in Europe were reading this thing and were reaching similar conclusions. Well, they had an emissary, and because Governor General of Turkistan, General von Kaufmann, spoke perfect German, the Mennonites, the German-speaking Mennonites from the Russian Empire, believed this was a sign. This is God's man. So he said, yes, come on over to Turkistan, come on over. Well, so he arranged an audience in St. Petersburg and entrusted Mennonites to Alexander II, the Tsar. Some context here. Russia had been taking territory in Central Asia. You had the British trying to make inroads. You had Russia, the big bear. And so this Turkistan, the Central Asia region, became a hotly contested battle. So of course they wanted settlers like us to be a buffer zone between the native populations and to fill in the territory already won. So you see dates here, 1822 and 1873, 1873. So Khiva was recently won. Tashkent, 1865, 1864. And over to the east, in Kyrgyzstan, 1871, 1881. So the conquest was still going on as Mennonites were traveling. We're fortunate to have some good artwork here. This is the conquest of Central Asia by von Kaufmann's artist, Vasily. And here they're attacking the walls of Khiva. 1871. In 1880 is when they were leaving to go to Central Asia. And the best stories are told by letters and diaries of people who were on this trek. Elizabeth Unruh was 14 when the trek began. She writes the most delightful diary. She makes observations that I'm sure all the men missed. And there were significant observations, and they're delightful. So she writes, we lived here in Gdanentine for 5 years, when all of a sudden the Great Migration fever took hold of many of us. Hermann Jansen. The year 1880 was also a year of decision-making for our church in Russia, since Russia had also instituted compulsory military service. Consequently, it was no longer possible for us to remain here. Again, this illustrates reason number one, motivation number one for leaving. Hermann Jansen. During the coming winter, 1879 to 80, my father sold all his land, as well as the Hof with its inventory and cattle. If I remember right, he had 3 farms and a mill. So they're giving up a lot to make this trek. Elizabeth Unruh again. Everybody was offering their place for sale. Imagine a whole bunch of people selling at the same time. That's not a good market. We were a long caravan, 80 families with 125 wagons and many horses to water. Yeah, think about that. You're not filling your engine with gas. You're looking for water and feed for your horses. In Central Asia, in the desert, that was no small matter. Herman, here's where you begin to feel what we do. it's hard to leave your home. And here they were, leaving everything they knew and everything they possessed. We had 4 wagons with 7 horses. The first was the largest, our family wagon, drawn by 3 horses. It had a door in the rear. This was the lead wagon, and I was the driver. And Herman Jansen, his father, was the main leader of this wagon train. Very disciplined. A bell rang when you were supposed to get up. A bell rang when it was time for breakfast. A bell rang when it was time for worship. It was a Sunday. So everything was organized, and the wagons were numbered. So no jockeying for position. You stayed in line. You ate the dust of the wagon ahead of you. Herman delights in the cultures he encounters. One could hear a maze of languages, some of which we could not even name. Herman and a few others become translators. They learn Uzbek, and they begin translating, and Russian. So the younger folks, the teenagers, were the ones who learned the language fast and could teach their elders. It was such a mix of people. And they all had their traditions. How are they going to live in harmony? Lower right, you see the Khivan hat. Miriam. Oh, Jim, you're here. Did you buy one of these hats? Oh. I have a picture of you trying one on. What happened? Well, imagine wearing this hat in the desert. They said, of course you do. It's cool. It keeps your head cool. Better than the flat black hats that we were wearing. A Russian peasant family. Sometimes we had a chance to buy a fresh loaf of bread, which tasted just delicious, even without butter or syrup. And the melons. Those of you who've been there, you remember the melons. Large and so sweet tasting. They were wonderful. They still are. And this is what? Samovars. Here's how they cooked. They heated their tea in here and their food. And sometimes you see it with another pot on top. And there was a teapot that they used for their tea. Martin Lawson, a historian and a minister and one of the main leaders of the trek. Many glorious hymns were sung in the camp to the praise of God. The hymn, Our Journey Leads Through the Desert, was a favorite throughout the journey. And here's a text of the hymn that they sang. Through the desert goes our journey. We usually sing this to the tune of Heart with Heart United. You know that? Ever sing Heart with Heart You la 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 la. How does it start?
Heart with loving heart united.
Okay. Can you read? Heart with loving heart united, meant to know God's holy way. Yet he needs to later day. In the cloud and fiery pillar, human, yet he was God's Son. And he leadeth all his people through the cross to heaven's throne. Imagine, you're riding on a camel, and you're singing this hymn. And Franz Barth says we encountered the first Kyrgyz, the Kyrgyz owls, or the structures. Here and there, Kyrgyz tents became visible, says Martin Clausen. And these are period pictures, so it's pretty much what you're seeing. And so you see they're going south through the Karakum Desert to Linsk. They passed through the desert, so they hired camels to carry feed for the horses. And they were small bags. The next day we broke camp again and moved on with our camels going ahead, showing us the way. So the road to Asia was lined with graves of loved ones, says Elizabeth Lenroe. And we have the number of children who died along the way. I'm not going to quote it because I don't remember the exact number. Here and further on, we often came upon the Sir Darya River. And since we continued to move in a southerly direction, the weather was mostly pleasant. Some came later and were driving through snow and blizzards in November. And then it was necessary to cross a range of mountains, so additional horses became essential. And here's a drawing from Franz Bartsch's book. They said they knew how to build these covered wagons because they had used them to move from Prussia to Ukraine, South Russia. Okay, so here's a broader map of Central Asia. Their first destination was Tashkent, which is now the capital of Uzbekistan. Let's see where Turkistan is to the east. And see how close China is. Some of you may have relatives who fled across the mountains into China to escape Stalinization. In order to reach our appointed winter quarters, where the first group had already established itself, we branched off from the mail route. We had a road to follow, a mail route, for the last stretch. And we had a Kyrgyz. We let a Kyrgyz guide us. They probably begged the Kyrgyz to lead them. Finally arrived at Kablenbek, just opposite Tashkent. So here they were for the winter. Kaufman arranged things for them. They were a military escort. Met them on the road and took them to Kablenbek. So here we are this winter. We've been on this journey full 18 weeks when we reached Tashkent shortly before Christmas. We stayed in Tashkent 9 months. And in that time, 80 people died. Diseases, epidemics, but also the men worked in the quarry. Apparently it was decent pay. And they refused to stop for a rest in the heat of the afternoon. They kept on working, and many of them died. They should have listened to their Kyrgyz neighbors. They knew how to work in the sun. And again, every kind of fruit we could think of. And along the way, they could buy bread on occasion. Franz says, I went to visit Shennebek, who is a local ruler, with his wife in her zorta. She was neatly dressed and served us milk, rice, and tea in her neat, clean home. The Kyrgyz moved onto the hillside meadows with their cattle, and the tilling of soil began in the valley. The plows, as you see, were wooden. And you just tear up the soil the best you can when you've got that kind of equipment. And now for the first mention, the class up. Herman Jansen writes, almost every week, we got long prophetic letters from Ohm, grandfather, Ep, her uncle. They contain pronouncements that always began with the words, "So says the Lord," to the church at Kaplan Beck. Then followed his own opinions concerning many things. Now you see, I haven't mentioned Klaus Ep before, because he was not at the beginning of this. I mean, he did not instigate this. He wasn't on the scene until later. But he was the kind of charismatic personality who could make himself heard and known. Is that right, Karen? You know about him. And you're welcome to say more about him as we move along. Elizabeth and Martin. When Father went to the palace to see General Kaufman, the general suffered a stroke. Father was very discouraged. No contract had yet been made for the land. The next day, when Father went back, General von Kaufman was dead. He was their ambassador to Turkistan. Martin Klassen. The death of Mr. Kaufman hit us hard, for he had always been friendly toward us. This is Aliyata in Turkistan. About half the group kept going north and east into what is now Turkistan. And I'm not going to tell that story because it might take another hour. But on one tour, I think it was 2008, we explored those villages there and learned more about the history of the people who went to the Talas Valley in Kyrgyzstan. So there you see the villages, Aliyata in the green square, Kubatom, Gnadentom, Gnadenfeld, Nikolaipol. It was consolidated as Nikolaipol, which of course was a Russian name. And so some wanted to go to Aliyata, others to Bukhara. They argued and discussed, read and talked, exclamation point. 72 families of our caravan decided to go to Aliyata. And most of the Malachna group went that way. And as they were making these decisions, they were partying again, and families were partying. This was a big deal. Jacob Jansen was the leader of the group. She left Tashkent for Aliyata in 1882. Now, is he an ancestor of anyone here? The road to the proposed site led 112 versts, control a measure much smaller than a mile. North into Shymkent, then east to the city of Aliyata. There I have it. One verst is 2/3 of a mile. And then 70 more versts via a mountain pass to the foothills through the Alexander Range to the south, about 165 miles. And yes?
How far had they come before they split to Aliyata?
They've been traveling like 14 weeks, 15 weeks.
How many miles?
I'd have to go back to my slide. But plenty. And this is rough terrain. The land was located high up in a mountain valley. It was so secluded that it seemed very suitable as a place of refuge, says Franz Barsch. And it was much better land than they ever found in Uzbekistan. Again, there were the villages. People from the Tract settled in the village of Kopental, while settlers from Malachna founded the villages of Nikolaipol, Gnadental, and Gnadenfeld. And they had a daughter village. We met a woman who proudly showed us her Mennonite-built house and told us about her ancestors, her mother and grandparents, who came from the Volga region to Aliyata. And she had pictures of them. Now, what happened there during the Stalin era was that everybody was rounded up and put in work armies. They all had to work, whether it was farming, whether it was forestry, whatever it was. They had work to do. Due to their high culture and the possibility of learning agricultural business from them, which they run very effectively, both the Kyrgyz people and other peasants adopted Mennonite practices. So here's something they brought and contributed to the local culture. The Germans introduced the best sort of potatoes and got the name Gloria Auliata. Old Jansen lived about 2 kilometers away in his water-powered mill, says Herman Jansen, and he worked there. Here's the Kutental House of Prayer, as they call their meeting houses. And still there, they call them houses of prayer. Outside the village of Kutental. The Holland breed of livestock produced by Auliata Germans had great success in the exhibitions. Pedigreed horses and livestock were sold to local people. Teacher Gerhard Kopper and Wilhelm Penner. Wilhelm Penner is off to the right, bearded all the way to the right side. He was a school teacher and photographer in Utbachet.
Was he Johann Penner's brother?
Say that in, yeah.
And he was a violinist?
Yes. Yes.
He was my great-grandfather's brother.
And you know, he introduced photography
Huh?
to Central Asia.
Say that again?
He introduced photography
Yeah.
and trained a young boy who became the father of photography and cinematography in Turkistan. Imagine a plain black-clad men, bearded, had that kind of cultural influence.
I don't know about him, but I do know J.K. Penner had some college from Prussia. They were late to coming to Russia, so they had, my great-grandfather had some college in Prussia, then came to Russia, and then came on the track.
Yes.
We can't hear that.
Your grandfather, say it again.
My great-grandfather
Her great-grandfather,
was J.K. Penner,
J.K. Penner,
had college experience in Prussia.
had some college education in Prussia,
Yeah, some. And then he went to Russia
went to Russia
as a young man
as a young man, yes,
with his mother and that brother.
with his mother and this brother, Wilhelm.
And they stayed in Russia, and he came to Beatrice, Nebraska. My great-grandfather came to Beatrice, Nebraska,
Great-grandfather went to Beatrice, Nebraska.
but this gentleman and the mother died there.
The Wilhelm Penner and his mother died here in Central Asia. And I think in the Talas Valley. Here are the ministers, with Wilhelm Penner right in the middle. After my conversion, says Herman Jansen, I was driven by the Holy Spirit to go to them, to the Kyrgyz. And the Kyrgyz couldn't believe it, because he had lived among them and he hated them. He treated them terribly. They were like rats and dogs. He was soundly converted and went to them as missionaries. And they were shocked and awed by this. Early in the 20th century, about 1,600 Mennonites lived in the region. In 1909, some from Uzbekistan also migrated to the valley. That's quite a crowd. Yeah, forced migration and collectivization under the Soviets in the 1930s scattered and impoverished Auliata Mennonites. On the left, you have Wilhelm Panner's son, who was imprisoned, starved, or executed. He died in prison. Hermann Jansen's son on the right eluded Stalin for a while by blending in with the local Kyrgyz. Tough times. Okay, 2008, after Jim and Miriam and Karen and others plowed the way, showed us the way, I did a follow-up tour because I went to hear Jim's lectures, I think 4 times. And at the end of the 4th one, he said, I'm not going to lead any more tours. John is going to do it. He forced me to do it? Sure, I'll do it. So here you see the farmland, the valley, with the Tian Shan Mountains in the background. Nikolai Ball. Johannesdorf was a daughter village. And here we met a woman whose parents were Mennonite and grandparents. And she's telling us her family story.
Do you know what the significance of so much blue paint?
No, I don't.
Because we were in Ukraine in 2018.
Yeah.
And so many houses and yards had blue paint. We asked our Ukrainian guide, and she said, I think it was the cheapest.
Actually, that's simply an Irish story. They did it here to identify with Ukraine after it was invaded by Russia. So we saw a lot of blue in Ukraine. This could have been for the same reason, I don't know. Her mother, Laura, left as part of the Soviet collective they called the Work Army. And there we discovered an art gallery by the German artist Theodor Gertzen. In Central Asia, the G gets lost. And the hard sounds, the Ks get lost. So here his work was displayed in a museum. And his paintings are tremendous. And cemeteries with common names that we recognize. And a few more. Okay, I said I was going to skip that. Okay, I'm going to skip it because I'm done now. All right, so back to the numbers. This is the group going to Bukhara and eventually Khiva. So 40 families said goodbye and slowly started toward Bukhara by way of Samarkand. Elizabeth. Samarkand was said to be 5,000 years old. All the walls glistening with all kinds of artistic drawings in mosaic fashion. It was so beautifully painted. And you see colors. They didn't wear black, most of them. Fabrics for sale. And as Elizabeth says, most delightfully, here in this burial place in Samarkand lies Tamerlane the Great, who wanted to rule the whole world. And he ruled a great deal of it. And yes, the tomb is here, and we visit it typically. So on to Bukhara and out of Russian territory. See, they were pushed by conscription. They had to get over the border. Well, this is Bukhara, old Bukhara. You've never seen so many people so richly dressed in silk capes with gold and silver embroidered with gold and silver. It was a sight to behold, says Elizabeth. No other tracker, no man makes this kind of observation. Well, and here is the Khan of Khiva, who says no to Mennonite settling there. And if you forget to look up, you miss things like this. This is current day. Guarding the Khan of Bukhara, they sent a delegation there in big walled city. The Khan of Bukhara did not want immigrant settlers. He didn't want to be bothered because Well, who knows for what reasons, but they ate pork and they raised pigs. Well, they were told they were not allowed to do that. Well, okay, we can do that, but still, we're not allowed to settle here. But Mennonites were stubborn. They went back and forth across the border between Bukhara and the Russian Empire 4 times because they got chased out and they went back. And when the Khan of Bukhara said, you can't settle here, some said, well, who is he against our God? So they were stuck for the winter in Zedebulak. This is Fred Belk's image in his Great Trek book. And we return to this place every time, and Jim, you led your group here too. Uncommon hospitality. Well, I said uncommon. It's common there. Besides several other buildings, a mosque was placed at our disposal. This one. We use the main hall for church services. Some even live in there, some live in the porches outside. Now, was this because of their generosity? No, they were forced to do so by the Russians. But they learned to get along very well. And we go back to this village, and the memory is still there. And we get a grand reception every time we go, because they remember the Mennonites who lived there. Looks like this now. This is the current structure. They called it the Blue Grandfather, but the last time I was there, they said, no, that means green grandfather. So, whatever. The Imam, the older one to the left, and the younger Imam came, and the man to the right was just there. There are benches under the trees near a pond, and they sit there for their gossip sessions or fellowship. Holy moments. Here we retrace history. We're in the mosque, and we recall Elizabeth Stauffer's grandfather, Jacob Klassen, who was baptized by the Penner's great-grandfather, Johann Jansen, in 1882. Things like that. Baptisms in the mosque. Oh yeah, I would ask my students, okay, a ragtag group of Muslim immigrants enters your town. Would you offer them your church house? And why not? Well, here are delegates. I can see more reason on the left. And also Klopsap, Herman Jansen, were delegated to go to Khiva to ask for permission. Well, the Khan there decided, yeah, he has some land further east, west, all the way to the Aral Sea. And so they decided to go, and they went with Thanksgiving. They rode the rivers and they crossed deserts. Everyone had to mount camels. And many did this reluctantly, and not without fear. There was elevation, it had to be. The mounting of the camels proceeded with many cries of fear. Here again, I imagine the wife saying, why did you bring us here? Now we moved into the desolate, awful, silent desert, where the eye saw nothing but sand upon sand. Here we could rightly say, our journey leads through the desert, says Jacob Klassen. On the one hand were high sand hills, and on the other deep gullies. The path was so narrow that the walk of the camels and horses caused the sand to trickle into the depths. Yet here, as on the entire journey, the hand of the Lord was over us, so no evil befell us. They're always interpreting this in the most positive light. Ah, yes. And one night, there was this famous 1882 comet that lit up the skies and they could read newspapers. Laura, you're nodding your head. You know something about this?
Oh, I know very little, but Haley's comment.
Haley's comet. Yeah. So the remaining journey from here, with the exception of our horses, had to be made by boats on the Amu Darya River. A number of boats had to be hired. And these were big boats. I think we might have, very large boats. Like 50 families could be in one barge. And they caught fish. And they talked about catching sturgeons, 5 feet long. I mean, I guess we have to believe it. They said it. And it was a terrible time there. For 4 years they lived there. 24 families gave it up, went to the United States, many to Beatrice and some to Newton. They said, enough of this. So relatives raised money to bring them to North America, where they could have a decent living and maybe even profitable. So the Khan said, your whole village of 40 families will be brought to Akhmachet, into a large park of my brother. Here you can build houses and live a peaceful life. A few days later, several hundred high-wheeled carts were brought with orders to move us and all of our possessions to Akhmachet. And there you see the high-wheeled carts. Within the square, a large open area we built, the church house, the school, and a teacherage, a home for the teacher. It was Wilhelm Henner at first. So it was all enclosed within this wall. Houses were arranged in a rectangle, dwellings abutting each other. Wilhelm Henner, the teacher, had to supply his own fuel since he couldn't be offered a salary. He eked out his living doing fret saw work. Carpenters here, you know what fret saws are? What are they? Intricate, small saws.
Coping saw.
Something like that. So here he is with his children. And finally, he has had it. He's accused of taking too much fuel. And that's one reason for leaving, plus he was sorely offended by his uncle. So the city of Khiva, still walled, 6 or 7 kilometers away from our village. And the Khan had many needs. He ordered large quantities of European furniture at a good price, so the carpenters as well as the artisans and craftsmen had good incomes, remembered Franz Marsch. Those who did not find employment with the Khan found work at the Khiva market, where crates for the export of candy sugar, as well as large lanterns with wooden frames, were in high demand. Orders also came from the Russian city of Petro-Alexandrovsk across the river. This is a firewood market. So the Khan took the Mennonites to a large hall that he had just built as a summer palace. And he wanted to have a parquet floor built. He had seen a floor like this in St. Petersburg. And he asked the Mennonite craftsmen if they could make this. Well, they got together and consulted and drew some plans, and they said, yeah, we can do this. This is still there. Oh. You walk on it when you walk into the summer palace. There you see Mennonite handiwork, doors, and a bed for the Khan. He didn't use it as a bed. They had mats on the floor. He used it for his throne. But those tall, very heavy doors are as solid now as they ever were. more building projects, and there was another summer palace out in the countryside that helped him build. This building was the Palvan Trade Center, built by Mennonites, but financed by a local businessman. So what to say about these Mennonites? They were builders, craftsmen, and contractors. They grew vegetables and fruit, raised cattle. They milked dairy herds and manufactured cheese. Some worked as seamstresses, sewing for the Khan's wives or for the market. They bought more land and learned to raise rice and cotton. Some were laborers in manufacturing plants. I think they eventually had 50 acres, 50 or 60 acres beyond the walled garden. So here's Wilhelm training Pana Buva. That's what he was called. We're not sure. There are various stories. So he taught Hudabergen Divanov photography and gave him the first camera. Culture was coming to Central Asia. So German Russian Mennonites seeking to escape the world became modernizing agents in Central Asia. They introduced new agricultural crops, methods, implements, and new breeds of livestock. Among the crops, they introduced potatoes, tomatoes, peas, beans, eggplant. When we're there, every day we eat salads with these products. Now, they were exacting. They would pay what they promised to pay, but they didn't want to hire any lazy people. So, to see whether a young man was a good worker or not, they would invite him to a meal. If he wolfed down his food, they hired him. If he took all evening to eat, they said, no way, we don't need you. Well, nobody in the village knew what was going on. The millennial conversations were unknown to them. There was Uncle Klaus Hermann Jansen, great struggle. His parents Hermann and Cornelia remained with Epp in his remnant to the very end. And Hermann Jansen writes, all of these tensions injured my spiritual life so much that I realized that I must leave. So my young wife and little son Abram and I, together with 3 other families, moved to Ali Ata in 1890. So Concept's prophecies concerning the second coming, he predicted the second coming in 1889. And so the congregation was ready. He was seated on a table with white garments. And there they waited for the second coming of Christ. As you know, it didn't happen. We wouldn't be here, presumably. So after this was over, he went inside. And he came back excited. Hey, I know why. This is the wrong date. My clock was tilted. It gave me the wrong date. So again in 1893, he predicted that. And this time, he would ascend into heaven. But that failed. He died in 1913, 6 days after his wife Elizabeth died. And after their 2 surviving children had migrated to Beatrice, Nebraska. While looking upward for the New Jerusalem, it would appear, I say, that Epp missed the kingdom of God within his own community of faith. Okay. They had trouble with the Soviets too. In 1930, there was a survey made with every household, every person noted, and every animal they had, everything they planted. And so they knew what they were doing. We'll skip this part. But the community there flourished. By 1934, numbered 150 families. Here is the Russian secret police report. 103 pages. The conclusion, one of 2 conclusions was, the German colony Akhmedjet still exploits the hired labor. Well, they paid their labor, but to accuse them of taking advantage of the peasants was a common charge for kulaks. And the colony is absolutely not influenced by Soviet authorities, not having even now any Soviet organizers or cooperatives. They refuse Soviet textbooks and they refuse state money. Well, in 1935, they took a vote about whether or not to collectivize. The vote failed, so auditaves. The primary leader was arrested and imprisoned. And many of you will know this story. In the final days, 10 leaders were imprisoned, and one day there was a trial.
Can't hear you.
Thank you for the reminder. 10 leaders were arrested by the third vote, and one day there was a notice in the newspaper that they would be tried the next day. So a man who had migrated there on his own in the 30s went to the streets, and he watched these 10 ragged, bony men dragged to the courthouse, in the courtroom. Well, everybody knew what was going to happen. They had said in advance that the men will be shot and the families deported to Siberia. Well, that changed, and it might have been interference by the locals that prevented that from happening. But in any case, the men had asked for a Bible to be brought. And after the trial, before the sentencing, auditaves held up this Bible and said, everything we do and everything we believe is because of this book, our Bible. Nothing you can do will change us. And all 10 said something similar. So, of course, they were sentenced to be shot, later commuted to hard labor. And in a few days, cars and trucks arrived in the village of Akbachet. And when the women of the village discovered what was going on, that these vehicles were here to deport the 10 families, they came streaming out of their houses. And they began chanting, all or none, you take all of us or none of us. And the children came with them. And they crowded around the vehicles, on the backs of the trucks. They laid down on the road in front of the tires. All or none, all or none. The Soviets walked away. But they came back with a very long line of cars and trucks, mostly trucks. And the commandant stepped out and said, okay, have it your way, you're all going. So they eventually made their way to a village called Village Number 7, about 30 kilometers north of the Afghan border. And there they were dumped. They said, let's see if you can survive without exploiting the peasants. Yeah, that's the story. All right, how are we doing for time, Andy?
We should wrap it up quickly, soon.
Oh, well, how much is soon?
10 minutes?
All right, we can do that. I'm going to go through this quickly.
Another hour?
Yeah,
Yeah, this was the first hour. We'll do the second hour soon. The only thing we could see was a well dug by Mennonites. And we would visit the school. Here's one of our travelers seated at a Mennonite bench, a school bench, that they used in their schoolhouse. And they were always pleased to show us things that Mennonites made, like this man. These doors were Mennonite doors. And they would bring out objects that Mennonites had left them or gave them as they were leaving. To this day, the story goes, the imam takes the village farmers to this field to ask God's blessing on the season's harvest. They gather here because it was the Mennonite cemetery. Perhaps it is still sacred. By choosing this place, they honor the memory of those people who had once been their neighbors. All right, so city of Khiva. If you studied math, you may know about Al-Khwarizmi, the father of algebra, born in that village. And was part of this Middle Eastern Islamic golden age. And that's where the museum is located. This was the old rendition. Mr. Karimov, he was the one who made things happen. He took the money that many of you gave for this Khiva-Kaufman partnership. I think this was the time when I handed $10,000 in cash that you all raised. And here are some of the artifacts. Yeah. The Grand Museum didn't happen because the government shut it down. And that's another long story. But now there's renewal at Akhmechet, largely because of Sofia Samatar and her book, The White Mosque. How many have read it? Most of you. And the old well is no more, it's now refurbished. And here's a shelter for guests. So when you come to visit, you can get out of the sun. Oh, and this is the school principal that we would see every year. And it is being refurbished. Buildings are being remodeled. This man, a businessman, is heading up the restoration. And we don't have to tell this story anymore to them. They tell it to us. A community of German Mennonites lived in friendship and cohesion with local population in this area for a period from 1883 to 1937, thanks to a wise and compassionate attitude of inter-ethnic harmony and religious tolerance created by the Khan of Khwarezm, Muhammad Rahim II. So this is there. This is now the testimony. Whether visitors will come or not, I don't know. Plans are for a hotel, a museum at Akhmechet, restaurants. They want to reconstruct some of the houses that Mennonites built around that courtyard. I say, okay, commercialism. But on the other hand, my second thought is, the only thing left to tell the story was that old well. This is much better. They now are telling this great story in an era where we need to hear it. Okay, thank you. Other questions?
I have a mic.
Oh, a mic. You don't have a question, you have a mic. Okay, back to Jim.
I can maybe speak loud enough. Would you want to reflect a little bit more on the irony that Mennonites came to Asia in an effort to escape from the world, and yet the meaning of their presence there now is modernization?
Yes, yes. I don't know what more to say than that, but that certainly is the case. And the Khan, by the way, allowed them to settle there because he wanted these innovations. He wanted things he had seen in St. Petersburg. So printing press, an electrical plant, all kinds of things were brought by these German-speaking Mennonites. And the Khan liked it. Another question.
You have to hold it pretty close.
What form do the Mennonite villages or churches or communities have in Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan?
None, there are none in Uzbekistan. But there's a remnant in Turkistan. You can Google road front.
Been there.
Been there. And there's a guy who's been writing about Mennonites there, and there's a remnant there. Some wanted to leave when others migrated back to Germany. They had never been there, but to Germany. And some are stuck there because they can't get visas out. Robert Friesen, our friend from Hanover, has this thing in his crawl. He said the Kyrgyz ran us out. They took over our houses, our businesses, everything. They ran us out. And he seems to be still a bit bitter about that. But it's all local ownership now. It's Kyrgyz run, Kyrgyz owned, Kyrgyz managed. Let me see here. Oh, by the way, By the way, this is the Khan's brother who owned the garden that Mennonites were invited to settle. The tall guy. And there was a pond for fishing. And here's the Khan with some of his staff. And that guy is his son, who becomes the next Khan, and essentially the last Khan. And this woman contacted me out of the blue and started sending me photos and stories, because this man was her grandfather who served the Khan. And for generations, her family had served the Khans. So she has an archives all her own. Yes, David.
What characteristics of Western countries led them to believe that the Antichrist was present in Western countries and they had to head east to avoid it?
One reason they had to avoid the Antichrist in the West was because there was no king or queen, no royalty to negotiate with. How do you deal with a democracy? It looked like a mess. And of course, with the revolutions and civil war and on, there wasn't much to be said for parts of our history. I got this picture from that woman. I don't know who they are yet. I want to identify them. Well, now Khiva is reborn. New restaurants, some on rooftops, a new hotel has been built for all the guests who will come.
One question. How did the Kyrgyz and Khiva, the Khan in particular, resist Russian hegemony and remain somewhat quite independent? What was the means by which that was accomplished?
They suffered under the Soviets. Some just stayed out of the way. Others were forced into a work army. It was not a pretty time, not a pretty sight. But many of them survived, and their families continue to live in Khiva or nearby farms. There are many stories to be told about the Soviets and their power over the local populations and the Mennonites, who were then local. Back there, Laura.
Yes, I know that Sophia Samatar's trip was very important to her, just from many conversations. And what I'm wondering is, have you had other people who have some basic knowledge of Islam, like she has from her father, in your groups, and what was their response, and how did the local people there would respond to them in conversation?
She was on my 2006 tour, and I noticed she was always writing. And finally, I sat by her and said, "What's up?" "No," she said, "I'm writing memoirs, and this is a part of my story too, and I'm looking for my own cultural identity." So it was all woven into this memoir, which is pretty amazing. It's had wide acceptance, from LA Times to New York Times, widely accepted. So that has done two things. It's made North Americans and Europeans who care aware of that story. The other thing that I critique her for is she brought Klaus up into the center. Again, Klaus did not start the trek. He joined it later and became very influential. But I think Fred Belk says, he calls this a Klaus journey. He tagged along. The other thing to say is, okay, he was human. Perhaps today we would say he was mentally ill. So we see his humanness for what he was, its effect on people around him, and we take it for what it is. No need for judgment. Past generations have done enough judging. So we let the story stand. Karen, anything else you want to say about your ancestor?
Not really.
No.
His wife is my ancestor.
Okay, his wife was her ancestor.
But I did catch what I think is a mistake. I think it's a mistake. You said that his 2 surviving children came to the Atlas. Actually, only.
You need to hold it really close to your mouth.
You said that his.
Yeah, by the way, feel free to vote to leave.
You said his 2 remaining children.
Yes.
Traveled, they migrated to the Atlas
Yep.
area. Only one did.
Only Klaus the third.
Yes.
Okay. Okay? Don't always believe your sources. Okay. And here we are in the museum. It's just a delightful place. Here is our father, Karimov, who made all this happen. A view of the inside of the museum. That's one side. Here's the other side. Okay, we won't go to Zilabala. We'll stop here.
Well, thank you so much, John. I assume you'll stick around for personal interactions and questions.
I will.
Okay, well, great. Thank you again, and thank you all for coming. And for those that are interested, there are a few items up front that people brought along today. Some of them are little animals that come from the same sorts of templates and patterns that are in the exhibit. So those came, and there's another little tray here that people have.
That Karen brought.
Yeah, that Karen brought.
I'd like to say something.
Come on up.
Okay.
Or meet you halfway.
Yeah, that works too. Hello, this is good night.
The items over there on the table have been made by Uncle Gerhard Esau, and his grandson, great-grandson Mark, has donated Mr. Esau's tools. You can find them back there. They look rather primitive, but they made this platter, which was presented to my grandparents for their silver wedding anniversary in 1937. And Gerhard Esau, as a boy, was on this great trek to Asia with his parents. And as a teenager, I don't know exactly how old he was, but he and 2 other young men in the village there, where the people had finally settled in Akmashet, they decided they'd like to go back to Russia, where they came from. And I believe, I understand that they did it unknowingly to the rest of the group, even to their parents. They each took a horse and went back to Russia. And Gerhard married my grandfather Schmitz. He's my other grandfather. On the other side of the family, he married his older half-sister, and they eventually came to the United States, and they settled in the Beatrice area. So, and he was a master craftsman with wood, taught by his father, who was one of the main people who worked for the czars with that parquet floor and some of that furniture.
Thank you.
Thank you for that story. All right, well, thank you all for coming, and John is available to answer questions.